Hello, and thank you very much for tuning in to the podcast series by the New Silk Road Project. I'm your host today, Charles Stevens, the founder of the New Silk Road Project. This series is dedicated to understanding and raising awareness of one of the most important development strategies of the 21st century, China's Belt and Road Initiative. The centerpiece of the New Silk Road Project, an initiative supported by Jeep, CSIS, Magellan Capital, the University of St Andrews and Shira, was to travel the course of the Silk Road economic belt from London to Yiwu in eastern China, interviewing the key actors and academics along its course. We will have to apologise in advance for some of the tangential moments in this podcast series, and also the variable quality of audio footage. We do hope this series sheds important light into China's growing global presence and the significant changes taking place across Eurasia. Central and Eastern Europe are playing increasingly important roles, both as an investment destination for Chinese money and as a transport corridor in a widening Eurasian network. We spoke to Jakub Jakóbowski, Senior Fellow of the China-EU Programme at the Centre for Eastern Studies, who is analysing some of these socio-political and economic processes taking place across the region.
So basically, my the first experience with China was more business-oriented. I just did business consultancy in the Chinese market, and then I moved into a think tank community because China's rise is one of the greatest stories of our time. That's a cliche, but that's true. And the think tank community there's plenty of opportunities and lots of topics that are not very well covered. So you could just pick out of a blue ocean of topics. You can just pick anything you want. And this gives you kind of analytical freedom, and that's why BRI is so important. It's so fascinating. It's so important. Yet there are still so many things to learn about, so we can have some actual value added to the discussion by it. And of course, talking directly about BRI, it's just Poland's position within this project, especially when it comes to what's actually happening now, and I mean by that EU-China train connections, we have become the major transit country, like the kind of a gateway. Yeah. So there's a lot of interest, but in terms of government institutions, local governments, businesses, logistics sector, and so on, they have some additional expertise on that. So that's why we focus on this particular topic.
And before we sort of zoom in on BRI, can we look at some of the predecessors of the Belt and Road Initiative? How does the 16+1 programme differ from the Belt and Road Initiative to Poland?
What's very interesting is that, to me, BRI is slowly moving towards a very similar form of international cooperation. And in a way, 16+1 can be analyzed as a kind of a testing ground in terms of how to institutionally coordinate international relations in the regional scale and now on a global scale. So we are kind of, as CE countries, we are kind of used to talk with China in such formats which are not very specific, which have a very, very broad scope of cooperation, and which are slowly getting institutionalized. And we can see that in terms of BRI. And this is how it happened with the 16+1. So at the very beginning, there was virtually no specific agenda, just general goals. But the whole format was aimed at learning about each other and making goals more specific and creating some instruments and so on. But I think this gives us, as CE, some expertise when it comes to EU policy towards China on how to deal with that, because there are very specific things like negotiating drafts of documents with China during the Belt and Road International Forum. China just used the same techniques, negotiation techniques as during 16+1. So this is how these two things are linked on this institutional level, but also in terms of the actual content, 16+1 is becoming more and more focused on BRI issues. So this is like Chinese experts are like explicitly pointing at that, saying that 16+1 is a structure, but BRI is a content.
Excellent. Good. Thank you. And do you see the Visegrad Group's expanding relationship with China as a threat to greater political integration with the EU?
Okay, I think there's one more topic linked to your previous question that will actually lead us to the answer to this one. China's model of cooperation, the model that it offered to Central Eastern Europe, was based on its experiences with the developing world, with the global south. These are regions with a very weak normative stance, and regions where China could come and propose its own standards. And I mean both like governance standards, but also technical standards, financial standards, and so on. And so one of the key aspects of 16+1 cooperation is the financing of the infrastructure, the thing what the China does just basically everywhere in the world. And he's offered a model of financing that is like directly linked to its experiences in the developing world. So Chinese policy banks lending to local governments here with state guarantees on the loan, which is the first clash with the EU law and regulations, and also no competitive bidding, so no open tenders, which is the second like bone of contention. So China offers money, but it needs to secure that it will create demand for Chinese companies in China, so it needs to secure it formally, which is against the EU law. And in this regard, I think there is a fundamental like clash between the EU integration in terms of norms, law, and what China offers. But on the other hand, we are here working hard on explaining to China that this is not actually, like, it's against the EU law, so that's the first like thing that they need to adjust. But on the other hand, there's also a business component to it, saying that leaving this law and political question aside, they are very important, but still China's offer is not also like profitable for us because we have a wide access to capital. We have our own capital, EU funds, like international financial markets where we can like finance our development, and China's offer is not that attractive. It is for Serbia, Somalia, Maldives, and Pakistan, but not necessarily for V4. But still, we're working hard on how to use cooperation with China to actually speed up our growth. And this is an actual opportunity for more European integration. Like, it's indirect, but Chinese market in China's finance potentially, if like introduced properly, could boost CE's growth. And like we are just trying to reach the European average level of development, the economic convergence, and possibly China could be a factor that will like help us to do that. Like if we export it directly to China and not through intermediaries in Western Europe, we could have more value added, we could have market to expand to, and so on. But there are just two sides of it. As I try to picture that, there's this normative side linked for China's undermining of the existing order, which is not in our interest to support, both in terms of law and politics, and like as I said, like business model it offered. But on the other hand, the very opportunity to talk with China bilaterally could be potentially used to boost our growth. And this is one thing that 16+1 has actually brought to this region, because before China had regular bilateral talks on many different levels with Germany, France, and the UK. And in terms of our region, we had like occasional visit of China's prime minister every like 8 to 10 years. So there was no like venue for any kind of bilateral cooperation. And here, like keep in mind that what China offered is not necessarily fully in our interest. It still gives us like kind of a platform to just express our interest, to try to force or encourage China to adjust to what it encountered here. Yeah.
And looking, I mean, as you mentioned, the bilateral ties are an important part of China's foreign policy. How do you see as the restructuring and reorganization of the State Council and also the amendment to the Constitution as affecting foreign policy?
I think, like on this very fundamental part, nothing has really changed in terms of the relations between the party and the state. Like, People's Republic of China has been funded by a party, and the structure of the state council, like reflected in 1949 how the party was organized. Yeah, so then we had, of course, like Mao's time, Deng's time, all kinds of ideas on how to structure that, and we had an impression, like we as the West, that China will kind of change, become more like based on rule of law and so on, and the role of the party will diminish. And in the early 2000s, that was these kinds of claims were pretty justified. But then it turned out the party decided it's not a good direction, so it like went back to the origins in a way. So like qualitatively, it is not like a fundamental change. It's just going back. But regarding consequences, I think this is a part of a very important process going on in China since Xi Jinping came to power, is that it is centralizing all of different like areas of its policy, both internally and externally. And while in 2000s you may expect that all kinds of different actors from China were going out, doing their own, like pursuing their parochial interests, and not necessarily in line with like Beijing's interest or like the center's interest. Now we can see that the center and the amendments to the constitutions are just a very like they're part of this process. The center is trying to centralize everything, yeah, and this will affect the China's foreign policy and the ways how to respond to that. So we may expect, for example, that if we make a deal with a Chinese private company or a Chinese province, if it's not in line with Beijing's interest, then Beijing might intervene. That might not have been necessarily the case like 15 years ago, yeah, but now it's, well, actually there are cases of that, like in Czech Republic, for example.
And as we start to sort of zoom in a bit more on Central and Eastern Europe, I know you visited Prague a week or two ago. What do you see the role of Prague being as a transit hub and also an economic centre on the New Silk Road?
I think this is one of the most interesting stories about the Belt and Road up to date. And like Czech model of cooperation with China is very unique when it comes to Central Eastern Europe, at least, because it was based on cooperation between oligarchs, between Czech oligarchs and Chinese oligarchs, a caste that is growing in China now. But it turns out, as this happened in Czech, that there is a limit to the power of Chinese oligarchs. So private or so-called private businesses, because the main actor of Czech-Chinese cooperation was a private company, CEFC, coming from Shanghai, with a lot of links with Chinese secret services and state, but nevertheless they were not a state-owned company. And they found a counterpart in Czech Republic. And actually, this is very important, that it's not always that oligarchs play a major role in local economies here. So in Czech Republic, you have plenty of very wealthy and powerful people. One of them is just the prime minister now. And it's not necessarily the case in all the CE, because there are some CE countries where you have virtually no oligarchs, like in Poland. But anyways, that was the engine of Czech Chinese cooperation, and it all started with a kind of a deal, exchange of favors. So Czech oligarchs just introduced the Chinese oligarch to Central European market, and as a favor, I think that was the case, he let them, Czech oligarchs, enter the Chinese market. One of the biggest Czech oligarchs enter the Chinese financial market for consumer credits, which is like a very hard thing to do.
What about as so you've addressed it, so Prague as an economic centre. What about as a transit hub? Does that have potential there?
And just continuing this story, so Ye Jianming, who was the prodigy child of Chinese private companies expansion, who was the main actor when it comes to Czech Chinese cooperation, who was also an advisor to the Czech president, and who was detained in February this year, probably by Xi Jinping himself. He had a business strategy, and he was very explicit about it, to make Czech a hub for Chinese investments in Central Eastern Europe in terms of finance and like tourism and transportation. Generally, airlines were about to set up their presence there. So that was his idea, and he started to buy up assets linked to that. So he bought a part of one of the biggest financial groups in Czech and Slovakia, and also an airline. He probably as a result there were new connections linking Czech and different Chinese cities and so on. So he was about to set up 2 of those hubs. And the key question now is, how do these goals of this Chinese oligarch translate into China's general goals as a whole? Because now the assets of this guy, he was detained, and the assets both in China and abroad were put under the state ward of Chinese state-owned companies. And the question now is, are they going to continue this? And I think when it comes to financial cooperation, I doubt that we can elaborate some more on that. But when it comes to tourism, just answering directly to your question, I think there is a strong potential, because the number of Chinese tourists coming to Prague is increasing, and I don't know the specific numbers, but it's 200, 300,000 people a year. Prague is a major touristic hub in Central Eastern Europe, so basing solely on these passenger flows, you could think about setting up a hub here. But when it comes to cargo traffic, that's quite a different story, I think, and the potential is rather limited.
And looking at Prague and the Czech Republic as a strategic hub too, China Energy purchased both a football club and historic buildings. Why is this being done through a private company, firstly, and 2, what are they hoping to achieve from this?
Once again, coming back to how do these 2 lines of thinkings, what's the relations? The line of thinking of this company and Beijing itself. So it's coming back to the centralization drive. My personal idea, it's hard to base this on evidence, because this is very opaque, and this whole expansion of CFC in Czech was very opaque. But my impression is that he had strong links with secret services, probably, with Shanghai government, most probably, with some Chinese faction within the party, most probably. But he was detained eventually, probably by Xi Jinping. So it turns out that his line of thinking was not aligned with Beijing's line of thinking. So we could see about like a different dynamic here. So I'm just wonder if speaking about his expansion can this be labeled as like a Beijing's master plan, or was just Beijing just supporting as it was unfolding, but necessarily controlling it? And maybe he was just detained just because of that, because he was too independent from Beijing.
You mentioned the question of a lack of transparency, and that's something that the Prime Minister Babis in the Czech Republic has also presented criticism of. Do you feel it's possible to retain a strong or continue a strong China-Czech Republic relation with these issues?
I think it also looks to me that a large chunk of this dynamics came from within Czech Republic. So the hypothesis that these were Czech oligarchs that actually used Chinese funds to pursue their goals is also plausible. And the level of collusion between oligarchs, Czech oligarchs, and the Czech politics is very high, and there are very close business politics links there. So it's just that lack of transparency when it comes to Chinese investments, which is generally true, met lack of transparency of like Czech politics. I'm not a specialist on Czech internal politics, but it turns out it was like that. And in a way, there's this whole scandal, paradoxically, could bring more transparency there, because first of all, like CFC investment Czech was a hot topic in Czech, as far as I know, in Czech Republic, and journalists were like trying to cover that story, but now like everybody's looking at it after what has happened, and like when it was merely a private company, Beijing could say no, it's like a private business, like they do things as they want, and we are not responsible for the transparency. But now these are state-owned companies, like managed by Beijing itself. So now they don't have this argument anymore. So maybe they could be like more inclined to be more open about what will be the future strategy of these Chinese state-owned companies in Czech and so on. So I would say they could be slightly more transparency there because of this dynamics.
And one last question about the Czech Republic. Of course, there's a growing trade deficit between the imports and exports in the country. How can this be addressed, and is it possible given the demand for Chinese goods?
So, you just touched upon a very important topic on the trade relations between China and CE, which is hard to decode because of the position of CE in the global value chains. So V4 has a tremendous deficit with China, more than like $25 billion. Just you can look for the numbers, but it's there, and it is a political topic. But at the same time, we have a very large trade surplus with Germany and Western Europe that kind of offsets this deficit. So if you look at Poland, for example, you'll see a very high deficit, like 12-1 when it comes to Chinese exports and Polish exports. But anyways, we have a general trade surplus because a lot what is produced here, like it's not always the case, but you can think about this China, CE, Western Europe triangle in a way that Chinese components are being produced in Western China or Eastern China, which are then imported here, assembled. There's some value added here, and then get exported to Western Europe. And sometimes it is even re-exported from Germany back to China, yeah, because this is how this generally works. So my personal take on trade deficits, and this like both in Czech and Poland and other CE countries, is that you really need to look into that. And on the other hand, China's exports to this region is not always necessarily facilitated by Chinese companies. So the largest chunk of imports, Polish imports from China, is electronics, like mobile phones. Yeah, some of that is Xiaomi or Huawei, but most of that, these are iPhones or Samsungs and just you name it. So it's, as it happens, these trade deficits, although they look really scary, needs to be put in this broader context. But that being said, China's market is closed to many different types of goods, and it needs to be addressed on the political level, and it is. So keeping in mind that this trade relations and deficit, this is a complicated issue. Nevertheless, it's very in the interest of the EU and CEE countries to push China to open up even more, because this deficit could be reduced if China opened up some of its markets, services markets too, which we are quite good at. But I just once advised a IT company to enter to China, but the conditions are just no, you just don't do this, because we are asked to form a joint venture that will give 51% to a Chinese company, and it will have to have access to the source code of this solution, and also we need to install a backdoor for Chinese secure services. So it's like you just don't do this. So there are still many things that can be addressed on the political level when regards to this trade deficit. But I just want to stress that this thing is not that scary as it looks. It's just the position of CE in the global value chains. Yeah.
And turning our attention briefly further south towards the Balkans and specifically the Pelsajac Bridge, as you know, the China Road and Bridge Corporation has successfully bidded on it, despite the protests of other EU players and companies. Can a successful relationship be maintained if there's resentment growing within the EU from this undercutting of their services?
This bridge is a very interesting case, which is very different from what China does usually when it comes to building infrastructure. So usually China lends money for this money to be used for a certain project, and as I said, the state guarantees on these loans, no open tenders, and so on. So lots of EU criticisms towards that. So basically it works in Western Balkans. There's one project in Hungary, the Belgrade-Budapest Railway, which is done using this model. But Pelsajac Bridge is a very different thing. Yeah, this was an open tender won by a Chinese company that used EU funds, and now China is going to build this bridge. And this happens in CEE, but before there was only one case of a project of that scale. That was in 2011 in Poland. The Chinese Kovek company won a bid to build a part of a highway, which was a spectacular failure. They just ran from the construction site with no announcements whatsoever, and we had a long-term lawsuit on that. We won, but anyways, we really wanted this to be built quickly. This is the Pelsajac Bridge is the second attempt of that scale to build a large project using basing on EU rules and EU money. And going back to your question, could relations be maintained if it failed or something? I think Chinese are kind of preparing for that. They are not commenting this project openly, although to me it's a great victory, because it's the second project of that scale. There's a second chance on the EU open tender market for Chinese companies. But there's virtually no press coverage in China. It's not a political issue, and I think it's because they know they're on a thin ice in a way. Because if you look at the details, it turns out this is a huge project, and they need to finish it by 2020. So it needs to be done very quickly. The price they gave is very low, And this is very similar to the COVID case in 2011. Like not that much time, very low price, and then it turns out that China may have to pour their own money into it, which is that they just don't like it. So, in a way, even if it failed, the political, it's not high in terms of political relations now. So it's kind of low profile. So even if it fails or stops, or even there's a problem, it could still stay on a low profile.
And there are a lot of initiatives that aren't as high profile as something like BRI, like the Juncker Plan per se. And it was interesting that you mentioned EU funds in that context. What are your opinions on the Juncker Plan and its role in the region? May that be in tandem with something like BRI, or as a own specific case?
I like to use this very instrument, the Juncker Plan, the investments for your facility, to try to explain what's its response towards the Belt and Road 16+1, which BRI and 16+1 are using basically the same financial mechanisms. Yeah, Exim Bank and China Development Bank, lending, state guarantees, no open tenders, and so on. And this is an example I often use to show what CE stands. At least EU 11 out of 16, the countries that actually have access to the Juncker Plan, prefer to use Juncker Plan to the Chinese money. So if you look since 2012, you had virtually no projects using Chinese money. And I think for now, more than 5 billion euros being used from the Juncker Plan. And what's very important here that if you compare structural funds, which are grants, don't need to repay that. Yes. And Chinese money, which are loans, Chinese loans always lose. And this is the case, like you had tens of billions of euros used since 2012. Since China came here, we are using almost exclusively EU funds because they're transparent. They have much better economic conditions. Yeah, there are Polish companies that can actually build this project and so on. But Juncker Plan is even a better example. You have a loan by European Investment Bank and a loan by Chinese banks. And then it turns out, countries just use the Juncker Plan because it's also more transparent. The interest rate is lower. There are no political controversies there. There are open tenders. So basically, this is a very important lesson that CE is rational about its development. It just uses the best options on the table. And for now, there are many European options on the table, and we use it because it's in line with our law, because EU law is also our law. Yeah, also in line with our economic interests, and it's much better money. Yeah, and Chinese money is actually worse. So even by looking at Juncker Plan and Chinese money, you can see that Juncker Plan is much more attractive to the region.
And with this in mind, what do you see as being the greatest challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative in the next 5 years?
I think it's a lack of sustainability of this financial machine. Yeah, so looking from this financial point of view, Belt and Road is kind of a way to locate China's trade surplus, US dollar surplus, and drive it away from US treasury bonds and just invest it somewhere else. Yeah, but the idea is to create additional demand abroad, yeah, and to shift the surpluses from the old ways towards the new ones. But the problem here is now that the rise of this debt might be unsustainable. There is this whole narrative that is gaining momentum about the Chinese debt trap, yeah, and I think it's partially true. That to a large extent it is true. I think that China needs to get additional demand from abroad, especially now when Donald Trump is threatening China that it will block the US market when like EU is kind of closing or at least trying to negotiate more openness and so on. China needs to build additional demand, and it needs to do this quickly. And the thing is that the recipients of that money that could potentially be too much of a burden for them to get indebted so quick without this kind of long-term thinking about sustainability. And one point of this line of thinking that actually my thinking is not that much aligned with this debt trap idea. I think, like, looking at what Beijing bureaucracy is talking about, they want to make it more sustainable. I mean, that's the goal. I think it's logical. You can build a lot of infrastructure in small countries in 5 years and then just like kill them with that debt, yeah? Or you can build a kind of a long-term policy on how to actually attract more business activity building that infrastructure, yeah? How to attract more investors from China and other countries and so on to enable these countries to actually repay their debts and use this infrastructure, which is generally good. I mean, I think maybe it could be kind of a naive thinking, but at least when you talk with people in Beijing, they seem to know that if they don't make it sustainable, that they will kill the initiative, they will provoke political controversies, and they just won't provide China with external demand in the long term. Because if you kill these countries with a debt, you won't have a demand in 5 years, so it's very short time thinking. And I think, like, my framework while looking at that is just that there are internal actors in China which pursue their own parochial interests, like Chinese railway company, Chinese construction company, Chinese shipping companies, big as state-owned enterprises. They want achievements quick. They want big deals. They want to build it, and they just don't care. They will lobby for state money to be poured in, but they just don't. It's not like in their interest to care about long-term sustainability. And on the other hand, you have a central bureaucracy that actually has the privilege of this long-term thinking, and they know that they need to, if they want to use up Chinese overcapacity, they need to make it sustainable. It's like you won't provide China with external demand by building a railroad. You need to spark a 15 years long real estate boom along the Belt and Road to use actually this steel and concrete. And I think they are aware of it. And the key question now is here, in this framework of short-term, long-term trade-off, who would win and what will be the actual outcome? Of course, provided that the intentions of Beijing are genuine, that they want to do this. But of course, leaving this economic sustainability part, unfortunately, Chinese use economic presence as a political leverage too. Not necessarily as Russia does. It's not like open blackmailing, but in the long term, they want these countries to be politically aligned with them. And there's a serious question about what are the implications for the 21st century.
On that note, of the 65 plus countries participating in BRI, I think it's only the Czech Republic which is a clear democracy, and the implications that has is quite substantial. Yeah. And I think it's I think my personal view on that is that we should use these dialogue platforms to actually explain that to China. I mean, they push toward the world. Yeah, it comes from the internal dynamics. They just have to go out, and they will.
and they have a lot of resources. I mean, they have like almost unlimited resources to do that, and they face opposition. But I think like we should explicitly talk about those problems, and they try to force them to adapt, to make it more transparent, to make it more in line. Transparent means less like undercover political pressure, to make it more in line with economic interest, that is less debt distress, yeah, and make more aligned with existing norms, that is EU law. And I think, if you went beyond the general narrative on 16+1 as a platform, like living inside Czech Republic and Hungary, living inside Czech Republic and Hungary, which are like two cases of how these things went bad, but on bilateral level. But still you have 16 countries talking with China, and this is a platform when you can actually address these issues. And if you went beyond the general narrative about 16+1, which is that it's killing the EU's unity and facilitating China's economic influence, if you look at how concrete issues are being discussed, it's just, as I try to picture to you, we try to be pragmatic, and we want to make China adjust. And if you look how the money is spent here, it's not spent according to Chinese model. And on the other hand, for like last 4 years, we are negotiating an alternative financial mechanism that's in line with the EU law, that the CE countries could join and jointly decide where to pour money in. And we want to make this happen. And this is, I think, a way in which BRI and the 16+1 could be used as a way to change China.